Haven't seen these for a while. Let's see, Rainbow Suspenders, Theater Reviewing Persona, it's the week before Easter. All evidence points to me talking about Godspell. If you've been subscribed to my channel for a decent length of time, then you probably already know that one of my all-time favorite musicals is Godspell. It's the reason I got on YouTube in the first place, and if you're really interested in that story, you can probably find it on my channel somewhere. Some of my favorite plays are the plays that really force you to suspend your reality even further than you normally would. So the time and place are ambiguous, the costumes, props, and settings are relatively minimal, and the characters are such that they pretty much just become timeless. So shows like Our Town, The Fantastics, and the show we're going to look at today, Godspell. This retelling of the Gospel of Matthew doesn't take place in biblical times, but nor does it take place in the 70s when it was written, or really any definite time or place. Though it uses the words from the Bible to tell the story of Jesus, things like setting, costumes, and even characterizations are pretty much left up to each individual cast. As such, turning this play into a movie becomes something of a challenge because movies, by and large, have definite times and places associated with them. But this movie, which stars a number of members of the original stage cast, manages to do that pretty well. It actually did a pretty good job of maintaining the ambiguity of the setting while still presenting a good retelling of the story. But how well did they accomplish this? Well, let's take a look in our second episode of From Stage to Screen. First of all, how did the cast and director do with this specific performance of the show? Like I said, a lot of the original cast members from the musical came back to reprise their roles in this movie, including David Haskell, the original John the Baptist / Judas. But there were a lot of new cast members as well, including Lynn Thigpen, Katie Hanley, and a young Victor Garber as the Jesus figure. And they do a good job of giving the same energy to this production that they do to the stage production. One thing that I feel like they do really well is the relationship between Jesus and Judas. In Godspell, the characters of John the Baptist and Judas are kind of rolled together into the same character. So the guy who initially calls and baptizes the group, forms the community, and becomes Jesus' best friend and right-hand man is also the guy who ends up betraying him. The little moments that these characters have in the movie when this progression is taking place are really subtle and really well done. Both Victor Garber and David Haskell are very talented in these roles and give very nuanced performances, even in the moments when they're just goofing off. I also like the interactions of the other ensemble members as they get closer to each other and Jesus. Godspell is really the story about the formation of the community. Yeah, it's the story of Jesus, but it uses that as more of a vehicle to show us these people who came together and who formed a community around this leader. Each performance is a little bit different because the script is pretty open as far as specific setting is concerned. The first act is pretty much just Bible stories and a good chunk of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which are reenacted using various methods, most of which revolve around clowning. So the first act is very much comedic, and it can be very fun and enjoyable to watch. And in general, the individual scenes in the movie are very good. The only issue I really have here is with the transitions between those scenes. They pretty much just jump aimlessly from one moment to the next, whereas in the stage production, there was usually a reason for the progression. But then again, in a way, that does kind of work to the film's advantage, contrasting the free-spirited, fun-loving scenes with the drama that later occurs. The dramatic scenes from the second act are difficult for a lot of stage productions to pull off, and it's often where a lot of them fall apart, but this movie actually does them pretty well. I wish they'd taken a little bit more time to settle down before the Last Supper, but once they got there, it was a legitimately sad scene as Jesus said goodbye to everybody. And I do kind of like how when Jesus announces that somebody is going to betray him, they treat it as a game at first, as if they're still just playing.
One of you among us will betray me.
Could it be me, Lord?
Could it be me, Lord?
How about me, Lord?
Could it be me, Lord?
How about me, Lord?
Could it be me, Lord?
Could it be me, Lord?
Could it be me, Lord?
My only real problem here is the ending with Jesus' death, which always seemed a little off to me. I just never felt much emotion toward it. Now, to be fair, this is a really, really difficult scene to do well, as it is really, really touchy, and I've certainly seen it done worse. But I feel like what was missing was the authenticity. At a certain point in the narrative, the characters cease to be people and become symbols. The trouble is, you don't feel emotions towards symbols, you feel them towards people, and I think that's why this scene emotionally fell flat for me. It just didn't feel legitimate. It didn't feel like they were really grieving the death of their master. It doesn't help that the scene after his death has our ensemble cast singing and dancing while still carrying their master's dead body. That's just weird. But the rest of it comes together pretty well. They take advantage of the setting that they're in and the visual medium, just as the stage production took advantage of their minimal budget and the stage medium. I like the direction of a lot of the scenes, even though they don't necessarily come together as a whole very well. Really, the ending is the biggest problem for me, but unfortunately it's kind of a big one because that's what you're left with at the end. It could have been a lot worse, but I think it could have been a lot better too. So it's not a fail, but it's only a qualified pass. But let's take a look at the setting in, well, setting. Like we said, the setting is ambiguous, and the script doesn't give a lot of guidance for things like costumes and sets. The original production had the cast in sort of ragged, clown-like street clothes, with Jesus wearing a Superman shirt, of course, and the set seemed to be a back alley of some sort with a fence in the background and a couple of sawhorses. And that's really it, pretty minimal. It gives the whole show a sort of placelessness and timelessness, a suspension of reality that could take place at anywhere, anytime. And I've seen productions of Godspell take place in schoolrooms, in nurseries, and even in churches. It's not tied to any one time or place, whereas the movie is definitely taking place in New York City, and it's definitely a modern setting. But you could argue that that's just the choice they made for this production, and really it's a pretty good one. I kind of like that the home base for this group is a junkyard, which really resembles the sort of set you traditionally see in the stage production. But then they get to go out and use the settings of New York City, and they really use the city to its advantage. And it still feels like a suspension of reality because the city is completely empty except for them. It starts with the typical crowded New York City streets, but then all the people disappear and it's just the ensemble. And why shouldn't they use these sites to their advantage? Why shouldn't they be baptized in the Central Park fountain, or tell a story in an old abandoned movie theater, or dance on top of the World Trade Center? At any rate, this is one of the things that the film did really, really well. The stage productions take what they have and use it to their advantage, and really the movie is doing the same thing, it's just that they have a little bit more. New York City essentially becomes their stage. It becomes a place where these people can do pretty much whatever they want. And it takes advantage of the many varied settings that the city has to offer. It takes what it has and uses it well. Very well. But let's take a look at what makes this movie uniquely a movie in cinematography and editing. A lot of Godspell is essentially sketch comedy, taking a lot of the Bible stories and the lessons and putting a visually comedic spin on them. As such, comedic timing is an important aspect of the imagery, as well as tricks like sleight of hand and other pieces of stage magic. But because this is a movie, a lot of those tricks are given over to the editing department, and it's not nearly as impressive. And I think a lot of this is because most of the movie magic is just jump cuts. I think it loses a lot of the stage magic and wonder that you get from a stage production. Oftentimes the pace of the comedy slows down a little bit too. Not really sure why, just the editing is really slow. To their credit though, there are a number of comedic scenes which they play without any cuts at all, allowing the actors to do the job they know how to do. And a lot of the cinematography, especially when they're showing the city and a lot of the dramatic moments, is actually really good. The movie does have kind of a 70s feel to it, which can get a little distracting at times, but to be fair, the musical was done in the 70s. And if anything, a lot of the editing and cinematography just increases the feeling that we're in a suspended reality, which is what the stage production is usually going for. Strangely enough though, I think it actually does this job a little too well. I like the fact that the beginning and ending of the film take place in the crowded streets of New York, as if they're taking place in real life, but once we get to the suspended reality section of the play, it doesn't really feel real anymore. I mean, okay, yeah, it's a suspended reality, but even in the stage production, it still felt authentic. It felt like it was actually happening. The editing constantly reminds us that this is not based in reality, when honestly, just the fact that they're wandering around the empty streets of New York City would be enough to remind us of that. Due to its nature, the stage production always felt authentic and real. I mean, yeah, it's an ambiguous setting, but the characters always felt real. In fact, in many productions, the actors are basically just playing themselves. Even though it feels like it's in a different reality or a suspension from reality, it still feels like it's actually happening. The movie just feels a little bit too dreamlike. It never felt as though the Jesus character was a real person. He just felt like kind of a bizarre collective hallucination. They start out as authentic people, but then they never really demonstrate any of the characteristics of their authentic selves. They just kind of become these clowns with no connection to their past selves and no real basis in reality. Because of that, this doesn't feel so much as an exploration of the gospel and a look at the formation of a community as it does a bizarre fever dream. And maybe that's what they were going for, but it just doesn't have the same impact as the stage production. So again, not a fail, but only a qualified pass. But now arguably the most important category, how well does the stage production transition to the big screen? Let's start by looking at the changes they made as they transitioned from stage to screen. One of the biggest ones is the prologue. In the stage production, the first musical number following the opening monologue is a strange piece simply called Prologue, which ties in with the next piece called Tower of Babel. Actually, if you go back to my very first videos on Banking 8408, you can find that one of the very first ones I did was actually a recording of the Godspell cast I was a part of performing Prologue during one of our cast reunions. And for my 2-year YouTube anniversary, I did a cover of the prologue myself, singing all 8 parts. I'm kind of a dork. Basically, the prologue consists of our 8 ensemble members who aren't Jesus and Judas taking on the role of a famous philosopher or thinker from history, like Socrates, St. Thomas Aquinas, Leonardo da Vinci, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the like. Individually, they sing their life's philosophies, taken from actual writings from the philosophers, and then in the Tower of Babel section, they sing their philosophies against each other, creating a kind of cacophony of sound where you can hear individual snippets of the philosophies, but never the whole thing. They argue until John the Baptist calls them and baptizes them and thus forms the community. In this way, the show illustrates these very different people with very different points of view of the world coming together, forming this community, and then being sent back out into the world. It's one of Stephen Schwartz's more brilliant compositions, and it serves as a great introduction to a story that's supposed to be about the formation of a community. Many productions choose not to do the prologue, either because they don't understand it, or they don't think the audience is going to understand it, or simply because it's just too hard to perform, as it does require all 8 singers to sing completely different words and melodies simultaneously, which is pretty hard to do. But the reason why the movie chose not to do it is actually pretty easy to see. This is something that really only works on stage. I mean, this is suspending reality beyond the point where movies typically feel comfortable doing, and it's really, really challenging to transition to movie form. So they came up with an alternative prologue, which is actually pretty good as well. It shows our 8 ensemble members as ordinary misfits who, for whatever reason, feel dissatisfied with their life. We see bits and pieces of their lives until John the Baptist appears to them and they leave their old life behind to follow him and Jesus. Which actually does capture pretty much what the disciples of Jesus did, just kind of picking up and leaving. What we miss, though, is the idea that all of these people are different. The different philosophies from the stage prologue illustrate pretty clearly that even though all of these people have very different points of view on the world, they can still come together in a community. If anything, the movie prologue actually shows us that these people are pretty much the same, not fitting in one way or another and bonding together because of that. So in that way, the movie prologue is actually a little bit more discriminating than the stage prologue. Also, the point of many aspects of this musical is to show the community coming together and learning and then being prepared to go back out into the world. That's why they removed the stage paint at the end, and the movie almost got it right. They show the ensemble members carrying Jesus out and going back into the real world, and then we actually see the crowded New York City streets again, but we don't actually see the ensemble members in the crowded streets. They just disappear, and I have to ask, wouldn't the ending have been more compelling if we could have seen the ensemble members going back to their everyday lives, but with a new outlook on them? The other changes are mostly minor ones, having to do with the order of the stories and the songs. Act 1 of the stage production is essentially the sketch comedy section, with all of the ensemble members goofing off and having fun and learning these lessons and these Bible stories, ultimately culminating in the song, "You Are the Light of the World." There's really only one moment where it's indicated that something bad is going to happen later on, and it's a pretty short one. Act 2, however, is a different story. It starts with an upbeat and happy number called Turn Back O Man, which is moved towards the beginning of the movie, and then it proceeds with the darker storyline. So we have Jesus yelling at the priest, Jesus distancing himself from the group, and eventually Judas's betrayal, the Last Supper, and Jesus' death. Spoiler alert. The movie basically just plays out that series of events just like that, but in the stage version, the dramatic moments are broken up by more lessons and more comedic sketches. For example, the sheep and the goat story, which is one of the first things that we see in the movie, is one of the last things that we see in the stage production. And in addition to moving Turn Back O Man up farther, the other happy song in Act 2, We Beseech Thee, is cut entirely and basically replaced with Beautiful City. Beautiful City wasn't a part of the original stage production. It was written specifically for the movie, and it probably doesn't help the movie's case that even the composer, Stephen Schwartz, wasn't crazy about this song. he later wrote a better version of it. So this movie basically did the same thing that the West Side Story movie did, and clustered all of the negative and dramatic stuff into the second act, and all of the lighthearted comedic stuff in the first act. The problem with doing that, though, is that once you get to the dramatic stuff, there's never a break. The only really lighthearted moment after Jesus says, "This is the beginning," is Beautiful City, and even then, it's really more reflective than comedic. In fact, the tone shift is so abrupt that you honestly aren't sure what happened. You feel like you're watching two completely different movies. Whereas the stage production brings the drama in gradually, breaking it up occasionally with some lighthearted comedic moments. That's why right before the Last Supper and Judas's betrayal is one of the most upbeat songs in the entire musical, We Beseech Thee. But overall, does the transition work? Does this story translate well into movie form? Well, in a lot of ways, yes, it does. I love the way they use the setting, and the relationship between Jesus and Judas and the other ensemble members is done very well. My problem is this: so much of the movie is so disjointed and strange that I think if you aren't familiar with the stage production, you might be left a little confused. On stage, it makes sense for a lot of these things to be happening because you're on stage. You knew you were going to be suspending your reality the minute you walked in the room. It's a lot harder to do that with a movie, and this movie makes a good attempt, but I think it actually tries a little bit too hard to suspend reality. I think they might have done better to stick a little bit closer to reality, making the ensemble members a little bit more authentic and maybe eliminating some of the cornier editing tricks. It still works, but not as effectively as it could have, and certainly not as effectively as the stage musical often does. So it still gets a pass, but once again, a qualified one. So with 3 qualified passes and 1 distinctive pass, Godspell the movie gets a rating of acceptable. Well, thanks for joining us today. If you celebrate it, I hope you have a happy Easter. If you don't celebrate it, I hope you have a good weekend. And until next time, I'm the Scottish Reviewer, and I'm the Mad Hatter. See you later. Oh, come now, Hatter. Is it the best you can do?